Enchanted evening, and I'm going to pull my mask down so I can talk a little better. We are thrilled to have you here tonight. I think it's going to be another great program. We're always thrilled when Connor is here with us, and he's so knowledgeable about so many things in the park. We only have 2 more Summer Enchanteds left. Not to say we've saved the best 3 for last, but we've got some pretty darn good ones. Next week will be Danielle, one of our curators, and she'll be talking about some of the myths of Rocky Mountain National Park, so that should be fun. And then our final presentation will be the next week after the 1st of September, and that's going to be Adam Thomas, and he is one of the professors from CSU that was such a hit last year. You're going to love his presentations. They're always fascinating and fun too. So just a couple notes on us personally at Baldpate. We are losing staff by the droves. I can't get kids to drop out of college. They want to go back. So we are closing our restaurant as of September 1st, but we will have our to-go options available. So we're going to try and see if we can run that through September, and we will be open for lodging through the end of September as well. So we'll still have cookies, and we'll still be here. So do feel free to come by and stop by the key room if you've got guests in town or want to come back, and we'd love to have you. So anyways, that's our news from here, and so I'm going to turn it over to Connor, and thank you for being here. Yay!
Hey everybody, thanks for coming tonight, and if there's anyone online, thank you for joining in. My name's Connor Newman, and I'm going to be presenting to you tonight about some of the experiences I've had rock climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park, and sort of how the rock climbing that you may partake in the park or may see people going to do in the park is really quite related to the geology of the park, which is an interesting thing that as a geologist and a rock climber, I get to see sort of the confluence of the two, which is always really fun for me. So just to tell you about what I'm going to tell you about is we're going to start off with just sort of a brief Geology 101 course. I don't know if there's anyone who's a geologist in the room, but we'll be able to just do a crash course on geology so that we're all thinking and talking the same language, basically, when we're thinking about different types of rocks and the different geologic processes that affect Rocky Mountain National Park. And then I'll give you a brief geologic overview of the park itself. It's hard to sum up 1.7 billion years in like 40 minutes or so, but I'll just give you a sort of really high-level overview of what has happened in the park in the very distant past. And then I'll talk about a few famous rock climbing objectives in the park and how the character of that rock climbing is really intimately tied to the geology. So just to give a brief overview of what you could spend a whole semester learning about if you were taking a college geology course. This is the rock cycle. So we can see there's all these different arrows pointing from one block diagram to another. I don't want you to get too caught up in trying to read the different text on this slide. I'm going to zoom in on the different important parts of it. But the main thing to see just at this overview point is that the Earth is constantly in flux, essentially. So the Earth, even though on our time scales that we can observe in our, maybe if we're lucky, 100 years on this planet, the Earth is changing in those time scales, but it changes over much, much longer time scales as well. So I'm going to be talking about the 3 different primary types of rocks that geologists classify various rock types into. So the first type of rock I'm going to talk about is what's called an igneous rock. An igneous rock is a rock that cools from a liquid magma. So there's various parts of the Earth, you go deep enough down, and there's actually a liquid iron core in the Earth that spins and creates our magnetic field. But we're just talking here about closer to the surface bodies of liquid magma. So in this block diagram, that's given this classic orange shade here. And that magma can cool over time, and as it cools, it crystallizes to form individual mineral crystals that all interlock with one another. And if that cooling and crystallization happens under the surface of the Earth, it's called an intrusive igneous rock. You can think intrusive inside the Earth. And that's shown kind of here in this block diagram. If we had this big magma body, which could be called a batholith, we could cool that magma over time, and it would create a big hunk of something like granite that was deep underground. And if that granite were eventually eroded, it might pop out on the surface of the Earth like we have today in Rocky Mountain National Park. But there's also types of igneous rocks that are formed from the eruption of liquid magma to the surface. And when magma comes to the surface, we call it lava. So everyone's probably familiar with things like the Hawaiian volcanoes. Those are where there's active eruption of lava. And when that lava cools, it forms these characteristic black rocks that are termed extrusive igneous rocks. So extrusive, think exterior to the Earth's surface. So we've got intrusive igneous and extrusive igneous. And then that's one of the three major rock types that we've got. Next is sedimentary rocks. So sedimentary rocks are composed of tiny fragments of other rocks or soil that are eventually compressed enough. Oh, we don't like that. There we go. So sedimentary rocks are formed of compressed fragments. So in a creek out here in Rocky Mountain National Park, if you could go out and sit there for long enough, you would see sediment moving down with the creek flow. And when that sediment can eventually move down to a place where there's active deposition on top of the sediment, we get layers of sediment. So in this block diagram, geologists really like block diagrams, we've got a river flowing out into a large delta. And when the river flows out into the delta, it drops a lot of the sediment that it's carrying, and that sediment can eventually be compacted over time. So we've got lithification, which is basically a fancy word for compaction and cementation, and that eventually will form sedimentary rocks. So a classic sedimentary rock is like a sandstone. So if you drove up here through Lyons, you would have seen those really pretty orange and red rocks all around the town of Lyons. That's called the Lyons sandstone. So that's a sedimentary rock type. Then the third type of rock that we're going to be discussing tonight is metamorphic rock. So when you take any rock that's near the surface of the Earth and you put more and more heat and pressure on it deeper inside the Earth, or in this block diagram where two plate tectonics are moving together, you can create an extreme amount of heat and pressure. And that heat and pressure basically cooks the rock, and it changes the minerals that we find in it. It changes what the rock would look like to our naked eye, and we'll see a lot of that tonight. And that process is called metamorphism. So that metamorphism process helps to take a pre-existing rock and turn it into a metamorphic rock. So if you take the granite that we see in Rocky Mountain National Park and put it under intense heat and pressure, it would metamorphose into something else. And the same could be true with the Lyons sandstone as well. So you can go from either igneous or sedimentary back to metamorphic. So just to go back briefly to the big diagram, you see that all these different types of rocks, sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous, they're all connected. And there's this constant change within the Earth of taking one existing rock, putting it under heat and pressure, metamorphosing it, melting it, breaking it down. So the Earth is constantly in flux in this way. And now we'll look at a few pictures of these different rock types that are all from Rocky Mountain National Park. Well, almost all. We'll see in a moment. So this is a picture that I took in Glacier Gorge, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on. But we can see the kind of gray salt and pepper color that makes up the majority of this picture. That's the silver plume granite. So the silver plume granite is an intrusive igneous rock. It was formed at about 1.4 billion years ago, so it's pretty old. And then we see there's this black line that cuts through the silver plume granite, and that's what's known as an igneous dike. So in this case, the silver plume granite had cooled from a liquid magma, It had cooled into being a solid rock. And then at some point later on down the line, there was another magma body in the area, and the pressures within that body were apparently high enough that it injected some of the liquid magma into the silver plume. So this is a classic example of a thing that geologists call cross-cutting relationships. So if one rock cross-cuts another rock, we know that the rock that does the cutting is younger. And we'll see that a few times within the presentation today. And this is another photo of the silver plume granite exposed in Rocky Mountain National Park. This is the northeast face of Long's Peak, which is called the Diamond. And that's a really famous rock climbing area in the park. So now we'll look at metamorphic rocks. This is a picture that I took hiking to the Lock, which some of you may have hiked to. It's from the Bear Lake Trailhead. And we can see that this rock has a really characteristic kind of black and white banded pattern. And that is the thing that gives it away as being a metamorphic rock. So this rock used to be something else in the past. We don't know exactly what it was. But it was put under intense heat and pressure. And that heat and pressure has resulted in the different minerals segregating actually towards minerals that have a similar chemical makeup. And so we end up getting this black and white banded pattern. And this is what's called a biotite schist. This is another one of the main rocks that we'll see today. And I wanted to show you that this black and white banding pattern comes at a huge variety of different scales. So this rock is about 3 feet across. You could walk by it right on the trail. And this is the face of Mount Ypsilon, which is probably 1,800 feet, almost 2,000 feet tall. And you can see it's got those same black and white bands. So we see this one pattern occurring at all sorts of different scales in the park. And then these are photos of sedimentary rock. They're actually not from Rocky Mountain National Park because there's not much sedimentary rock left in the park. It's all been eroded away. So these are photos of the Flatirons, which are outside of Boulder. We're not going to talk too much about sedimentary rocks just because there's not much of them in the park. And just the last thing to go over in our geology crash course is the geologic time scale. So the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, quite old, clearly. And this is how geologists break up all that time. So this is a time scale going from oldest at the bottom to youngest at the top. You know, we're sitting up here right at the very top of the diagram. Geologists break it down into all these different eons, eras, periods, epochs. We won't need to worry about any of those after this slide. But the thing I wanted to give you a sense of is how old the rocks in Rocky Mountain National Park actually are. So the biotite schist, that black and white banded rock, that's 1.7 billion years old. So that rock would fall, you know, somewhere right in here on the geologic time scale. So very, very old. It's one of the older rocks that's exposed within any national park in the United States. And then the silver plume granite, which is that intrusive igneous rock, that's 1.4 billion years old. So it's probably right around somewhere in this area, also quite old. Then the geologic history of Rocky Mountain National Park takes a big leap. We don't have any other rocks that are exposed in the park until right around 50 to 60 million years ago. So there's just a huge amount of geologic time missing within Rocky Mountain National Park, and that's because that either there wasn't active deposition in this area, or all that rock that used to be here has been eroded away over many millions of years. So now we'll get a little bit closer look at the geology of the park itself. This is a Google Earth image, so you can see like there's the town of Estes Park. Here's 36, and there's the town of Lyons. And then when a geologist uses the geologic map, the colors are keyed to a different rock type that was mapped in the field. So there's kind of a whole lot of stuff going on in this, but the main thing I wanted you to see was that there's two colors that occur more often than any other ones. And that's this pink color that makes up a bunch of the eastern half of the park. And that pink color is the silver plume granite. So again, that's that intrusive 1.4 billion year old granite. And then the other color, unfortunately, just does not show up very well on slides, but it basically makes up all the areas that appear to have no color. So it's all this kind of tannish stuff in here, and that is the biotite schist. That's that black and white banded rock. So here's a photo of a classic exposure of the silver plume granite in Rocky Mountain National Park. This is the spearhead, and it has the very characteristic color of the silver plume. It's just sort of a bright white to gray. It doesn't have many bands or texture within it. And this is an area where we actually have these two rock types coming together. So this black rock on the right-hand side of this photo is the biotite schist, and the whitish salt and pepper rock over here is the silver plume granite. So in this photo, we can actually see where these two rocks come together in the field. So along this boundary is about 300 million years of history is missing right there. And then again, to show the scales at which the layering can appear, this is off the side of Long's Peak. So that's probably about 1,500 or 1,800 feet right there. So we can see that if you were climbing within one of these bands, you might think that you were just within the silver plume granite because it's got that grayish color. But there's actually these large bands where really these rocks are all kind of mixed up and mingled together. And that occurs, again, from the mountain scale to the boulder scale. So this is on your way to Chasm Lake. When you come up, and if you're hiking from the Longs Peak trailhead, you come up and there's a turn to either go left to Chasm Lake or right to continue up towards Longs Peak summit. If you go left towards Chasm Lake, you'll pass right by this boulder on your right side. And it's got bands of the biotite schist and the silver plume granite all mixed up together. And then this is one of my favorite boulders in the whole park because it is one of the best places I've ever seen that relationship of cross-cutting shown in the field. So this is the biotite schist again. You can always see that right off the bat by the banding, black and white, black and white, black and white. And then we see that all these bands are cut right there by a line, it appears. And when you look at the rock on the left-hand side of that line, that's all the silver plume granite. So in this case, we can see that the biotite schist, which at this point had cooled, it had solidified, it was a solid rock. This solid rock was cut across by the silver plume granite when it was still in its liquid magma phase. And we can see that occurring right in this outcrop right here. So now I'll kind of put the geology aside and talk about the rock climbing in the park, and then at the end we'll kind of bring it all together. So rock climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park has a really long and storied history dating back to the 1960s, and I'm sure it actually goes earlier than that. I just don't know much of the history myself before then. So this is a photo on the left of an early ascent of the diamond, which is this face right here that we're talking about a little bit later on. So an early ascent of the diamond versus a modern day ascent of the diamond. And there's a few things that we could kind of compare and contrast with these photos, is that this climber he appears to be hanging from his harness on gear. And so he's doing something that's called aid climbing. In aid climbing, one uses artificial mechanical devices sometimes to help yourself get up the rock. And that could either be because it's too hard for you to climb under your own power, or because you're trying to move fast, or there's any number of reasons why you might take part in this somewhat, some would say, brutal sport. But this group of climbers on the right, they're doing something that's called free climbing. Free climbing is very different than free soloing. So just to get that out of the way. He is free climbing because you can see his hands, you can't see his feet, but his hands are on the rock. So he is pulling himself up the rock under his own power. That's what the definition of free climbing is. But you can also see that there's a rope going down from him to his partner. His partner is belaying him. So if he were to fall, well, I guess first off, when you're free climbing, you advance up the rock under your own power, placing protection along the way. And that protection, you clip into your rope. And then if you were to fall, you'll fall to the last piece of protection, then one more of those distances because you're all the way above it. So you'll fall 2 times the distance from your last piece of protection, and then the rope will catch you. So free climbing is actually quite safe. Free soloing is now much more famous than it once was. But free soloing is when you climb up the rock under your own power with no protection. So if you were free soloing, you wouldn't have the rope, you probably wouldn't have a partner because you would never go free soloing with a partner. Most people wouldn't anyway. And there's, as I said, a long and storied history of rock climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park. And one of the places that it is written down is within rock climbing guidebooks. So this is the most recent guidebook that I know of for the park. So you can get this guide, and then it's about 350 pages long or so, and it's got many, many different route descriptions, tells you how to get there, what type of gear you should bring, what sort of difficulty you should expect, all things of this nature. Also, now we've talked about the geology. Everyone knows the difference between free climbing and free soloing. So now we'll actually get on to rock climbing within Rocky Mountain National Park and how it relates back to geology. So this is a photo that I took when coming in for landing at DIA. And this is of Glacier Gorge. So if you're ever flying in from the west coast, I suggest you sit on the right side of the plane. And when you're coming in for landing, when they turn on the seatbelt sign, this is, I guess, if any of us ever fly again, then when you turn on the seatbelt sign, they'll start their descent, and a lot of times they go right past Rocky Mountain National Park. So this is Long's Peak right there. I guess I've got some labels on here. So this area, or this little spire, is called the Spearhead. That's called the Arrowhead. And then this face that's visible is the Diamond. And again, the Diamond is a feature of Long's Peak. You can always recognize Long's Peak because it's got this really flat top summit. Kind of looks like a volcano. It's not a volcano. It's just erosion that has caused it to be flat-topped like that. So this is a Google Earth image of almost the same view. So just to orient you, see this long ridge that runs up and towards Long's Peak. That long ridge is right here. So again, we've got this Google Earth image, and you can see actually the trail up into Glacier Gorge goes right here up to Black Lake. And on this image, we can overlay a geologic map. And I know it, again, doesn't show up that well on this screen, but we see that most of this map is this pink color. So again, that pink color is the silver plume granite. And then to point out the spearhead, there's the spearhead sitting right in the center of Glacier Gorge. There's the arrowhead over here, and there's the diamond. So the thing to take away from this is that all of those different climbing objectives are all in the pink color, which means that they're all composed of the silver plume granite. And this is a view that you would get if you were walking up to Glacier Gorge along the trail that we saw just in the last slide. You can see that the canyon or the valley has this really wide U-shaped profile. And that's very characteristic of erosion by glaciers. So when a stream cuts a canyon in a V shape because most of the power of a stream is right in its center. It doesn't spread power out very much along its sides. So if you drove up along Colorado 7 from Lyons, then that canyon has a pretty steep V shape when you're down near Lyons, and the farther up you get, the wider and wider it gets. That's because you're going from a place where the canyon was stream carved up into the domain where we had more glaciers during the last ice age. So Glacier Gorge is named Glacier Gorge because it had glaciers in it at one point. And we can see that from this big, wide U-shaped profile. And then there's the spearhead right there. And this is the western face of Long's Peak. And then when you get up farther into the heart of Glacier Gorge, you've got a really great view of the western side of Long's Peak. Again, that nice flat summit. And there's these really cool spires that shoot off the ridge there. Those are called the Keyboard of the Winds. And we can see that there's actually a little bit of a rock type change in there, because look at the banding on those spires. So we can see that the top of Long's Peak, mostly without banding. That's a lot of silver plume granite. But then there's some mixing in this area with the biotite schist. So now to talk specifically about rock climbing on the Spearhead, which is one of my favorite rocks in the park. This is what a rock climber would call a topo. So just like a topographic map, when you go hiking, your topographic map has the place that the trail goes, and then it has the various terrain obstacles that you'll go over along that way. So if a topo for a rock climber generally has a picture of the thing that you're going to go climb. And then just like your trail would be on a topographic map, climbing topos have basically the path that the route goes, the rock climbing route goes. So we can see that on this photo of the Spearhead. Oh, and I do want to say, I did not make this topo. I'm not this artistically talented. So the topos are all from this website, and she makes some really excellent rock climbing topos if you're ever in the mood to look at some. So again, back to the topos, we have these two lines, the purple and the red line, and those document the direction of two different rock climbing routes. So this route is called the Sickle, and this climbing route is called the Barb. You see that there's a couple different sort of numbering systems on here. There's this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, on and on. Those are what are called pitches. So when you are rock climbing with a partner, with a rope, you're going to go free climbing or aid climbing. A standard rope is 200 feet long to 230 feet long. The person who's going to go up first, they take however much gear they want with them to safely protect the climb that they're about to go on. They start up from the bottom, moving. You don't have to move right within these red or purple lines. You can go wherever you want, but it may be harder if you don't go along the lines. So you move along, placing protection as you go. You eventually get to the end of your rope. The rope goes tight because the rope's attached to your partner. Or you get to a nice comfy ledge that you would like to set up on. When you get up there, you put in a couple pieces of protection to create what's called a belay. And then when you have a safe belay, you yell down to your partner, off belay, they stop belaying you, and then you pull up all the rope, they start to climb, so on and so forth. So that's called one pitch. So here's the first pitch of the Barb, there's the second, on and on, up the rock. And then the other type of numbering system on here is the 5-9, 5-9, 5-6, 5-4. Those are the difficulty grades of a rock climbing route. So difficulty grades go from 5.0 to 5.15. 5.0 is quite easy route by rock climbing standards, but you could still get injured on it if you were to fall without protection. A 5.15 is so difficult that there's like 7 people in the world that can do a 5.15 rock climbing route. So at 5.10B, the Barb is what would be termed nowadays as moderate. You know, it's somewhat hard, but it's not nearly as hard as the hardest things in the world. Back in the 1960s and 70s, 510B was the very hardest rock climb in the entire world. So these grades actually change over time in terms of where they are kind of on the cutting edge of rock climbing. So now that we all know about the various number systems in rock climbing, I'll show you a few photos of rock climbing here on the Barb, which is one of probably the best routes in Rocky Mountain National Park. So this is from, I think, the third pitch of the Barb. So you're looking down Glacier Gorge, and you can see that there's really kind of a wide viewpoint that you get, and this was one of the best parts of being able to rock climb in the park, is you get to go places where there are I would say less people. I wouldn't say no people, because the Barb is an extraordinarily popular rock climbing route. Almost every day in the summer, at least one party does this route probably. So here's looking down from, think about the third pitch. And then this is a photo from on the crux pitch of the Barb. So the crux is what climbers call the hardest single pitch or the hardest single move. So you'll notice that the rope is going down kind of right along this vertical crack. And that is because, again, we're talking about the silver plume granite here. The silver plume granite is very hard, tight, compact rock. It doesn't break very easily. So the places that the granite breaks tend to be along one vertical, or the crack systems can go in any direction. But oftentimes we climb the more vertical ones. So because the Barb is on spearhead, and spearhead's made out of silver plume granite, most of the rock climbing on the spearhead tends to be crack climbing. So for crack climbing, the climber shoves their finger or their hand or their arm or your entire body, depending on how big the crack is. You shove whatever appendage needs to be shoved in there, and then you essentially twist and tweak that appendage until it won't slip out of the rock anymore. And crack climbing is probably a more technique-dependent type of rock climbing than face climbing is, which is I'll be talking about in a moment. So this is the crux pitch of the Barb. So this is a finger crack. So you basically just put your fingers into the crack, and it goes up until about your top knuckle. And then you use those jams, they're called, to pull yourself up the rock. And the cracks on spearhead range in all different sizes. So the Barb has a finger crack as its crux. This is a different route on the spearhead. You can see that same kind of panoramic view. And this is the crack that we were climbing, so it's about that big. So it takes a slightly different type of technique to advance your body up that type of crack. And then once you get to the top of the spearhead, you've got really a cool summit to sit on top of. So this is the very top of the spearhead. It's almost like an overhanging bunch of boulders that are all kind of just jumbled together, but it does feel quite sturdy. And then you've got really good kind of 360-degree panoramic views around you of the rest of Glacier Gorge. So this is McHenry's Peak, which I think is a 13er, a tall peak in any case. And then you've got a great view of Chief's Head Peak, which is sort of right behind the spearhead. And then one of the best things about coming down from an alpine rock climb is that if you were gung-ho enough to carry a couple of beers up, you get to enjoy a beer in a really, really beautiful place. So that was the spearhead, and now I'll just talk briefly about a different objective in Glacier Gorge. This is the arrowhead, which is just right across the valley from the spearhead. It's got a very similar appearance. It's this kind of bright white to, there's actually some orange areas of weathering on the arrowhead that we see up here. And the route on the arrowhead that I did earlier this summer is just a ridge scramble. So in this case, you don't need any rope or anything. It's not even really fifth class climbing. It's mostly just scrambling up this big long ridge. So this is the route that you take to get up onto the arrowhead. You just kind of come up these slabs here, end up making your way onto the ridge line. And even though this right-hand summit looks to be tallest just from the place that I took this picture, the true summit of Arrowhead is over here. So you kind of scramble up onto the ridge, and then it's actually very flat up here. You just kind of walk across on your way up to the summit, and then end up coming down here. But from the summit of the Arrowhead, you get another different, really good panoramic view of Glacier Gorge. So the spearhead that we were just talking about, there's the summit of Spearhead, and the Barb goes up right there. So this kind of puts it in perspective how small some of these quote-unquote bigger rock climbing routes are. That whole route that I was talking about on Spearhead just is that tall. and here's Long's Peak for scale. So it's a good way to make yourself feel small and unimportant, is to be up in big places like this in the park. And then there's also a really good view looking down on Black Lake, which is the trail from the Glacier Gorge trailhead comes up right to here. So now we'll leave Glacier Gorge behind and talk about probably a much more famous mountain in the park is Hallett Peak. The Hallett Peak is really visible from Bear Lake. If you've been to the Bear Lake trailhead, when you look up and west past Bear Lake, you're basically looking at Hallett, which is this mountain right here. So just show another Google Earth imagery. This is Emerald Lake right at the base of Hallett. The trail to Emerald Lake comes up right here. That's where the trail ends. And then the Rock Climbers Trail comes up here, sort of goes across up this way. But the actual summit of Hallett is up here. Most of the rock climbing is on these first couple buttresses that are actually much lower than the full mountain is. So for instance, I've climbed Hallett, done the rock climbing routes on Hallett several times, and I've never been all the way up to the summit, because actually when you get up to here, you're tired and you just want to go back down. This is a geologic map, again overlaid on that Google Earth image. You'll notice that the geologic maps get worse and worse throughout the presentation. I swear that's not on purpose. That's just how it ends up overlaying on these Google Earth images. But it's still helpful nonetheless, because we can see that this is the area of rock climbing on Hallett. And the main thing to take away is that it's not pink. So if it were pink, like the summit of Hallett is, that would mean that it were made up of the silver plume granite. It's not pink. That means it's probably biotite schist in this case. And this is the topo for one of the more classic routes on Hallett. And as we can see, our suspicion from the terrible Google Earth image overlay is correct, that Hallett is not composed of the granite. Because if it were granite, it wouldn't have these white and dark splotches running through it. So much of Hallett is this sort of blackish color, and that is the 1.7 billion year old biotite schist. And then it's got these igneous dikes running through it. So those dikes, we know from cross-cutting relationships, are younger than most of this other rock. So Hallett at 5'8" and 8 pitches is probably right in the classic range of moderate rock climbing. So there's a huge amount of people that go out to do this rock climbing route every year. When you're climbing on Hallett, you again get a nice view looking down at Emerald Lake and looking across the gorge to some of the other big rocks on the other side. And this is the Mummy Range, which is in the background there. And then Hallett, because it is a different type of rock than we saw at Spearhead, the climbing character is actually quite different as well. So at Spearhead, you basically put your hands or fingers into a crack, try to put your feet into the crack sort of the same way, and you move up the mountain that way. On Hallett, there aren't very many crack systems. So Hallett, because it's composed of biotite schist, has fractured off all these various handholds. So if anyone's ever been to a rock climbing gym, Hallett is much more similar to climbing in a gym, I would say, with the added danger of loose rock, not knowing where you're going all the time, rainstorms, snowstorms, all this other stuff. But in terms of how the actual climbing goes, it's very similar to face climbing that you would do in a gym. Now we'll move on to Mount Ypsilon, which is sort of a forgotten area in Rocky Mountain National Park. I did this mountain last year, and I think I saw on a Saturday in July, like 4 people or something like that. So Mount Ypsilon, this is a photo from near the summit of Mount Ypsilon. So we're looking down at these 2 ridges. And this is the spectacle lakes that inhabit this cirque. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what a cirque is in a moment. But you can see here, this is another ridge scramble. So no ropes required. That you just end up, you hike to Ypsilon Lake, which is right there, end up going up onto the shoulder of the mountain, and then you just meander your way up this long ridge as it kind of narrows and narrows. And it's really cool because you get to go over these 4 little spiky summits. They're called the 4 Aces. And I'll show you a photo of them in a couple moments. But they give you just a great feeling of exposure and, again, 360-degree views. Then you head on up the ridge to the summit of Mount Ypsilon. And it's cool because you get to actually do a complete circumnavigation of the cirque. Then you come down, your descent route is this other ridge that's called the Blitzen Ridge. This is called, oh wait, sorry. This is Blitzen Ridge. This is Donner Ridge. So this is a Google Earth image of Mount Ypsilon. And again, this is the ridge that the route goes up. Then you go across the summit and back down. So you do a circumnavigation of this thing called a glacial cirque. So the glacial cirque is this big area in here. So many thousands of years ago at least, there were large glaciers that inhabited this area of the park. And the glaciers carve out these big wide valleys again, just like we saw in Glacier Gorge. In this case, it carved out a big wide valley between these 2 ridges. And then that's what geologists refer to as a glacial cirque. To overlay a terrible geologic map on it, we again see that there's just not much pink. That's the thing to take away from. We could have guessed that back from one of these photos because we see those really stark light and dark bands. So anywhere you see the light and dark bands, you know it's the biotite schist. And this is an area climbing along the Blitzen Ridge where you actually pass through a number of igneous dikes. So this is silver plume granite right here on the left and the right. And then in the center of the dike, we have almost pure quartz crystals. So these are really huge quartz crystals, you know, the size of your head, basically. And then these black minerals that we see interspersed in there, those are a mineral called amphibole. And those are more rare in the silver plume. So it's kind of unique to see these big amphibole crystals in this igneous dike. And then here's a side view of the route. So again, you come up and over these 4 summits, the 4 Aces. Then it's kind of a long slog up to the summit there. But this is the view from looking right at the summit from before the first of the 4 Aces. So you come to right about here, then you go up this one, down, up the second one, down. That's the third one. And then I think you actually can't see the 4th one in this photo because they're almost all in a line. Moving on to Mount Meeker, which is right next to Long's Peak. So this is the flying buttress of Mount Meeker. It's called the flying buttress because it kind of flies off the side of the mountain at you. And you can see that really well in some of the photos that I've got later on. But here's Long's Peak with the diamond. And then here's the flying buttress, which again is off the side of Mount Meeker. I think Mount Meeker is like 13.9 or something like that. So it's like just short of being a 14er. And then again, this is Chasm Lake. So here you can actually see the trails on here really well. This is the trail that goes to the summit of Long's Peak via the keyhole. And then this is the trail that goes up to Chasm Lake. When we overlay geology on here, we see that the pink color makes up the most of Long's Peak. But when we get over towards Mount Meeker, this is the summit of Mount Meeker. So the flying buttress is right about there. It's all just kind of jumbled up. It's like a variety of different colors that are a mixture of the silver plume granite and the biotite schist. And you can see that mixing really well in this topo for the root, the flying buttress. You can see that down at the bottom of the root, there's really small layers of light and dark. So there's a lot of biotite schist down there. When you get up higher and higher, there's these bigger bands of light, so that's the granite. So the climbing on Mount Meeker on the flying buttress is actually quite unique because you get to mix climbing on these 2 different rock types together. So you go from crack climbing to face climbing and sort of back and forth again. This is a good photo to show why they call it the flying buttress. This rock on the left actually looks like it's part of the rock that we're climbing on, but this rock is several thousand feet away. And so the flying buttress is this really skinny rib of rock that sticks off the side of Mount Meeker. And sometimes it's like 20 to 30 feet wide with maybe 700 feet of exposure down on both sides. So it's great for feeling like you're kind of out there. And the route that we climbed on this actually goes up this crack right here. So that's very similar to how you'd climb on Spearhead. And then you go up to this big roof. So a roof is, as it sounds, an area where the rock overhangs. You have to find your way around it somehow. So you go up to this roof, and luckily that roof occurs right at one of those layers where the biotite schist comes in, and then there's sorts of all these face holds that you can use to pull yourself through. So this is a buddy of mine climbing on this pitch right here. This is the crux pitch of the flying buttress route. And so he's placed his protection in this crack system here, and then he's right about to go up and climb right out through that roof. And it's probably one of the easier roofs to climb of that size anywhere, because the holds on it are just so big that you can almost just kind of climb through it like you're on monkey bars. And then when you come over the roof, you kind of go right back into crack climbing. So this is climbing just later on that pitch. You can see this is the width of the buttress. It's probably like 15 or 20 feet wide right there. And then on both sides of it, it goes kind of a long way down. And this is the final peak that I'll be talking about tonight, which is the diamond, probably the most sought after objective in Rocky Mountain National Park. Not too hard to see why it's called what it is. It's got a very distinctive diamond shape, and then the summit of Longs Peak actually doesn't look so flat when you're looking at it from this direction. But that's the summit of Longs Peak right up there. So this is the topo for the diamond, and half of all the rock climbing routes that go up this face. So there's a lot of different options to climb on it, but it's very, very steep. It's at high elevation, and it's kind of a pain to get there. So the combination of those factors makes the diamond kind of a more serious objective than most of the other rocks that I was talking about earlier tonight. And the casual route at 510A is actually the easiest route on the diamond. So something that used to be considered the hardest type of rock climbing in the world is the easiest way to get up this rock. And then from there, it goes on to much harder routes. So there's actually a 514 on the diamond, which is something that I think like 3 people have done it, or maybe not even 3, 2 or 3. So there, to orient you a little bit, this large ledge that runs across the base of the diamond is called Broadway. Broadway is, in some places you could camp on it, you could set up a tent, and in some places it's probably as wide as a sidewalk. So it varies. And then this face that's below Broadway is called the lower east face. And the lower east face is itself about 1,000 feet tall. So by the time you start to climb the diamond, you're already at 13,000 feet, and it's kind of a cold, inhospitable place. This is a wider view of the diamond just to show where Chasm Lake is in respect to the diamond. And then this is the lower east face. You can see the lower east face itself is pretty big. It's like nearly as tall as the diamond is. And then this big snowfield here is called Landslide. In Landslide, you can go up with most people use crampons. Some people use just those kind of little net things that you put over your shoes to walk on snowy sidewalks and stuff. And the way to get up Landslide kind of varies depending on the season. In the springtime, it's still all soft snow. And by around now, it's hardened up to it's almost ice. So it's very, very dense, hard snow. And the photo that I'll show you just next, I took from standing like right there on Landslide, looking across at the place that I took this photo from. So we'll get kind of a 3-dimensional picture of what the Longs Peak Cirque looks like. So that last photo I took from standing right there. And again, here we're standing on landslide, so you can get a perspective of what that looks like. This is the lower east face, and we actually can't see the diamond in this photo because it's kind of up and to our left. But the thing I wanted to show you was that we've got an apparent rock type change right here. So we go from down here low on the face, it's all that bright kind of gray and white. That's the silver plume. Then we get up to this elevation here, and we start to see mixture between the black and white layers. So there we're seeing mixing between the granite and the biotite schist. And then this is one of the features that I think is the cause for that big ledge, Broadway. Broadway occurs right where these two rock types come together. So when we have two rock types coming together, sometimes there's a contrast between how they're worn away by wind and water and all these processes. So this contrast has caused there to be a large ledge that climbers use to set up on. And you can see that at the left-hand edge of Broadway as well. So just again to reorient you, this is the right-hand side of Broadway when we were looking at the diamond head-on. That's the right side. This is taken from I was standing still right here, and I went from pointing this way to pointing up and to the left. So this is the far left-hand side of Broadway, and we can see it goes from granite up into biotite schist, and then back into granite. So there's this mixing that actually likely is one of the causes of this big ledge existing in the first place. And then rock climbing on the diamond is, again, much steeper than most types of rock climbing in the park. The diamond is like vertical to overhanging in some places. And it would be very, very difficult to climb it if there weren't a very special type of rock up here. So if it were just like Spearhead, if it were just a vertical crack that all you had was your fingers and your toes to hang on in the crack system, it would be extraordinarily difficult to climb. But what you can see here is that I've actually got my hand shoved into the crack where it's really good there, and then my left hand is on a really good face hold. So the diamond, because of the characteristics of the granite right there, is actually, even though it's quite difficult to climb, it's much easier than it could have been. If this were just a blank face, it would be really, really hard. But there's actually a lot of holds that you can use on the outside of the crack, which makes it a lot easier for those of us mere mortals. And the final thing I'll end with tonight is just talking through the route, the climbing and how it relates to geology on one of my favorite routes I've ever done, which is called the Black Dagger. So it's called the Black Dagger. It's named for this sort of black downward pointing feature that looks a little bit like a dagger. And you start from down here. So this is Broadway. And you start climbing up here, and you're making your way towards this black feature that eventually forms a crack system that goes through every size of crack that you could imagine. So the Black Dagger starts as a crack that you can only fit like the tips of your pinky in. At the very bottom, right here down at the bottom of the dagger, you just put your pinky and probably your ring finger in, and that's all that you can fit in. And then as the climb goes up and up, the crack just gradually widens until at the top you can stem, is what the type of move is called, from one side to the other. So it's a really huge crack system once it gets all the way up there to the top. So this photo is taken from the bottom of the Black Dagger pitch. So it goes through all these different sizes of cracks in one pitch, which is again one rope length. So when you start off the belay here, basically, you just have the tips of your fingers that you can get into the rock. And then you go up and up and up, and eventually you get to something that's this size. So this roof here is the top of the dagger feature, so we can actually see it even from way down on the Mills Glacier. That vertical roof right there is what we're about to climb through in this photo. So we've gone from just a tiny little crack to being able to fit inside of it, which is a really cool feature to have been able to climb. Yeah, just to sum it up, Rocky Mountain National Park is primarily made up, at least on the eastern side of the park anyway, of the silver plume granite and the biotite schist. Both these rocks are more than 1 billion years old, so they've seen a lot of Earth's history pass by them. The park has a really storied history of rock and alpine climbing, and to this day it continues to be one of the premier destinations for rock climbing in the U.S. People come from all over the world to climb in Rocky Mountain National Park. Different peaks in the park each have a different character to them. You could go face climbing on Hallett and probably never have to use a hand jam, or you could go climbing on Spearhead, and if you had never crack climbed before, you'd be having a rough day. And that different climbing character is intimately linked to the geology of the park. And then I just end by going out into the park safely and with a respect for nature, because the park doesn't care about you. A lot of times people say that they beat the mountain by getting to the top. If you are lucky enough to get to the top of the mountain, you have a very short window in which that you can probably stay there safely. So never kind of get too cocky about going out and climbing or hiking or however you enjoy the park. So yeah, thank you for listening. If anybody had any questions. Yep.
I assume you, doing the hikes to get to your destination, are those hikes day hikes? I mean, do they take a number of days to get to where you need to go? Do you camp along the way?
Most of the time you can hike there in just one day within Rocky Mountain National Park. So, for instance, to hike to the Spearhead, I think it's about 7.5 miles. So with all your climbing gear, it's kind of a heavy pack, but a lot of people do it in a day. One of the things that rock climbers get in the park and in many national parks is you can get something that's called a bivy permit. Stands for bivouac. I think it's a French word or something like that. And so a bivy permit allows you to camp in areas that are off limits to people who aren't rock climbing. You can't camp with a lot of stuff. You can't use a tent when you're using a bivy permit. You have to sleep in basically a sleeping bag for your sleeping bag. It's called a bivy sack. So it's just a waterproof sleeping bag basically that you sleep in case it rains. And a lot of the time it's nice to bivouac because you get to wake up in a really nice place having already done a lot of the work yesterday. So you can wake up in your bivy sack and have a cup of coffee and enjoy sunrise. Whereas if you're gonna do these routes in a day, for instance, when I do Spearhead in a day, you start from the parking lot at 3, 3 a.m. just to make sure that you get there and down before the thunderstorms come in.
These guys who carry the big mats, is that because they're not using ropes? They want to go up a short distance and they
Yep.
fall on the mat.
Yeah, so the big mats are for a type of rock climbing called bouldering, because they do it on these little boulders. I don't mean to, laugh or be disrespectful, but I don't boulder much. Bouldering, typically you look for a very difficult sequence of moves that is, quote unquote, relatively safe. Because you don't have a rope, any fall is a ground fall, is the saying in bouldering. So that's why they carry the mat, is so hopefully you can position it over any nasty rock or stump that's trying to break your ankle. But yeah, generally boulderers go for shorter routes that are very, very hard. I mean, the reason I don't boulder is because I'm not good enough probably to do most of the moves. But yeah, that's when you see those guys walking around, guys and gals, that's what it is.
So when you talk about protection, I think it's called, instead of the pitons and the old-fashioned rock climbing with free climbing, how does it protect you?
So the protection, I should have brought one. I actually have some gear in my car that I should have brought inside. You use something either called a camming device or a chalk or a nut is the other type. So a camming device, if you've ever seen rock climbers walking around with like harnesses and a bunch of gear clinging and clanging on them, if you see something that a lot of times people think they look like grappling hooks, it's this thing that it has a trigger and two lobes that are shaped sort of like a semicircle. When you pull on the trigger, the lobes retract. Then you put it into a crack, and when you release the trigger, yeah, the lobes go back to their normal position, and the pressure of the lobes outwards on the crack will hold you if you were to fall.
And it doesn't do any damage.
Yeah, it doesn't do any damage to the rock, which is the benefit of that type of climbing over aid climbing, where, well, nowadays people use cams to protect aid climbing, but in the photo that I showed of the historical climber in Rocky Mountain National Park, he had pitons.
Right.
So that's a metal spike that they banged into the crack. It's very damaging to the rock. So I think you might have to apply for a permit to use pitons in the park. I don't know. I don't personally ever use
With
pitons.
so many people doing it, you'd end up
Yeah.
go wrecked after 100 years.
And then the other type of protection that you can have is a bolt. So the type of protection that I was just talking about is what's called passive or active, I guess. A cam is an active type of protection. But when the second person is climbing past it, they take it out, partly because it's expensive and you don't want to leave them behind. You probably need it on the next pitch. But a type of protection that's left behind permanently that is less damaging than pitons or bolts. And bolts are like it's an actual, they look kind of like construction bolts, they're not. But you actually drill with either a power drill or a hand drill. Drill a hole that's 3 inches deep or so in the rock. And then you place this bolt into it and tighten the bolt. And then in the future, the lead climber who's using that route would just clip a carabiner to it.
Yeah.
And then you don't need to, it's much lighter to do that type of climbing, which is called sport climbing. All right. Thank you.
Red Rocks, Vegas, dude, I'm tired.
Thank you.
Colorado.
Oh, I like to climb all over if I can. Around Boulder, one of my favorite places is El Dorado Canyon, which is a state park.
Yeah.
And that's actually sandstone, so that's a sedimentary rock, which we barely even talked about because it's there's not much sandstone in Rocky Mountain. But yeah, the El Dorado Canyon is one of my favorite places. That's where I learned how to climb. Was in El Dorado.
Have you ever, I don't know if I said that, the
Penitentiary.
penitentiary.
Yep. Yeah.
That's pretty cool to get back in there.
It is really cool. It's not very tall. It's surprising. It's a very short canyon. It's like 50 feet tall. But it's really unique rock. And that's a volcanic rock that was erupted.
That's such a cool area because when you're driving through on the road, if you're coming from south and coming through, it's like all crazy rocks up here and just feels like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
good talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have you ever fallen?
Oh yeah, many times. Yeah. The protection works very well. When you place the cam correctly, or especially.